Welcome to Tech Support, a podcast at Mount Juliet Church of Christ, where we encourage and equip people to interact with the biblical text. We're your hosts, Brian LeMasters and Tim Martin.
This is the second episode of our New Testament background series, and today we're going to talk about the culture that we see in the New Testament period. Now, this could be several podcasts long, but we're going to try to talk about some major components of that today as we go into trying to understand a little bit more about the Bible and the world that Jesus lived in. We talked last episode a lot about Judaism, so we're mainly going to cover what I would call the Greco-Roman world and the surrounding society that Paul certainly encountered in his journeys and would have existed also in Palestine in Jesus' day. But I did last week promise, as we were signing off, I think, to maybe recommend some resources for our audience. We're going to put this also in the a link underneath the podcast there, or as part of the podcast, to be able to go to a little short bibliography. And I'll probably even put more in that list than what I mentioned today. But for some of our listeners who would like to they don't want to go buy 55 books about things, maybe some books that might be applicable for all of their New Testament studies. And so some of the ones that I would recommend, and Brian can jump in and give some ones that he might be. One of the ones by Everett Ferguson is called Backgrounds of Early Christianity. It's currently in its third edition. It could be purchased relatively cheaply online, probably for something less than $20, $25. It's paperback. Excellent resource. Dr. Ferguson has gone through many different aspects of culture, the history between the Testaments, Judaism, marriage, family, economics, all kinds of the Roman army, the military, the Roman political system. Very, but not lengthy. I mean, it's one of those things where you'll be able to read just 3 or 4 pages maybe on each one of those things, and obviously a lot of biblical references in there.
I'm glad you mentioned that one. That's one that I actually used for this episode. Okay. I like that one.
We'll find out if Brian properly used it.
Probably not.
He does a good job of that. Another thing that I recommend a lot to people are books that are really not one author, but are a collection of essays. So essentially you have a book with a couple of editors, and then within that, they may have dozens of essays on particular topics that have been assigned to people who are experts in that particular field. And that's a treasure trove of things to have there. So you're getting the benefit of a wide variety of scholarships. And one of those things, one of those books that I would recommend is called The World of the New Testament, Cultural, Social, and Historical Context. Joel Green and Lee McDonald are the editors. It's a terrific resource, pretty modern. I think it's maybe around 2013 or so. I'd have to look back and see its exact dating, but a great collection with a dozen or more essay authors in it about all those same different backgrounds. So you kind of get what you get with Ferguson's work, but then you get the benefit of having the perspective of several other people. Another recently published resource by N.T. Wright and Michael Bird is The New Testament in Its World. And it's got a lot of graphics, pictures, timelines, things in it, very, very friendly for the layperson to look through, and going through Scripture and describing things using different books of the Bible, and having some things that you need to pay attention to in that. So that's a relatively new one. I think that's probably published within the past 4 or 5 years.
Tim, pause real quick, just in case our audience doesn't know. You want to define what lay would be, a layperson?
Okay, everybody that goes to church, just about.
Yeah.
People that don't do what I would call New Testament or Old Testament or biblical studies professionally. Yeah. I don't think of you as a lay person. I may think of you as maybe ignorant and silly, but I don't think of you as a lay person in that way, because you've been professionally trained. You have education in biblical interpretation. You've got a lot of years of experience. You do it for a living, and so that's what I would mean. It's not an insult to people, but it's people that...
You don't have to have a PhD in biblical studies to read that book and enjoy it.
That's right. And I think it's really good. And it's not going to have a lot of technical jargon in it and things like that you're going to need to know. Another one that I would recommend as well is The Greco-Roman World of the New Testament Era by James Jeffers. It's kind of along the same lines. It's a single author, a monograph, if you will, but it's pretty handy. And there's some other ones that I will list, especially covering in particular areas like Jewish backgrounds. And also there is a series of books that I really like that covers each book of the New Testament in context. And so it's one, if you said, hey, I'm going to study Ephesians, or sometimes it studies a group of books. I'm going to study Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. I can get this one book as a study aid to do that. So we'll include some more things than just those, but I wanted to mention those because we said we would to our listeners there. But they're really resources you need to read to understand what we're talking about here. Is you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to know everything, but just realize the world's very different than what our world is in the Western culture, especially in the United States, and just be better informed about those things. You can read them, then you can go back and use them as needed, but at least it would give you a broad understanding of how they thought differently, what their worldview was, their economy. There are a lot of things we'll talk about today in this podcast. And so I really recommend that because it is, we really risk being false teachers when we interpret the New Testament solely with 21st century eyes. I mean, it's certainly useful to us today, but we don't need. Now, there are those who take a different interpretive stance than that. They think that we can interpret it in our own culture. I just don't tend to hold that view. I think we need to understand what its original listeners and original target audience and original author had in mind, and how they would have understood it. And then when we do that,
then you can bring it forward.
Yeah, then you can bring it forward. So, because sometimes it's applicable. You know, we don't have a lot of argument about circumcision and adhering to the laws of Torah, like dietary laws in modern day Christian churches, but they did in Paul's day, because obviously he addressed that in Romans and Galatians.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those resources, Tim. I feel like that would be a benefit to some of our listeners. Today, when we were looking at the culture, we're going to be looking at things like honor and shame, patron-client, slavery, limited resources that they had in their world. Let's kick it off with honor and shame. I feel like if you've been in one of Tim's classes before, you would have heard him reference this idea of honor and shame if you're working through a New Testament book. I know you think this is a very important element and one that sometimes isn't easy for us to understand in our culture today. So will you define this for us and then kind of walk us through what that meant to them and how it impacts our understanding of Scripture?
Yeah, and as we think about these things, they may not be front and center discussions all the time. They were more like an underlying ideology, or just like we talked about earlier today. What we think about freedom and democracy and things are underlying things that come to the forefront when we're talking about something. And so for these people, honor and shame was a natural culture. Just like today in India or in the Middle East, an honor-shame culture is the natural culture to have. And we'll talk more about that. But honor is defined, as Alka was able to cobble together from different sources over time, is a claim to worth that is socially acknowledged and respected. It's one thing for me to say I have honor. It's another thing for people actually to ascribe that honor to me or give me that honor. And it can be ascribed by my birth, maybe by my social class, which we'll talk a little bit. Sometimes honor is bestowed based upon one's gender, maybe one's profession or position in the community. But some of that is just by birth, by what you're born into, the family you're born into.
Would you say for most people in that day and age, honor was by birth, that it would be hard to gain honor through other means because the classes were more set? Or
I don't know. That'd be interesting to think through about. There is acquired honor, and mostly it's through competition and challenge we'll talk about limited resources a little bit, but there's only so much honor to go around, to use a figure of speech that we might use today. And so I'm going to have to subtract from honor from Brian LeMasters in order for me to acquire more of it. It's not this unlimited amount. I think the ancients thought about God's grace and spiritual gifts and lots of other things along those same lines. But yeah, I think probably we mostly think about a Roman senator or an imperial or a governor or someone that's probably born into that class, or even a high-ranking military officer, and not something like a centurion or something, but somebody high up in that. And in some ways, we kind of understand that today. Wealthy landowners, for example, were the generals of the American War for Independence. I mean, they weren't necessarily seasoned military veterans to do that. But I would say that is a huge component of it. I think when we look at Jesus' genealogies that are given, I think they're not only given to say, hey, I'm just telling you this guy was a descendant of King David, but think about what that brings with it, that you're a descendant of what many look to be one of the greatest kings and most energetic kings of Israelite history. He is of that. He is of that lineage. He is of the lineage of the Messiah. So that gives him a certain amount of honor, not just a title in those ways. And so I personally believe that those genealogies are also meant to give Christ the due honor through his birth that he would have.
So how would it be different today when we think of like Oh, well, yeah, we want to be respected in our society. How is this very different from us today?
Yeah, today I think we look for fame, or popularity. And I'm not saying that wouldn't be a component of this system, because obviously those who are honored, but we think about popularity wanes and it ebbs and flows with people. Some people are popular at a certain period of time. They're very flash in the pan. Some people are very popular and well thought of for a long time. And so, sports stars, whatever that is, the position of honor is when we think about somebody who we give a lot of respect to because of their position. For example, in conversations, we always refer to the president by their last name. But if we walked into the Oval Office to meet the president, we would not call him, "What's going on up there, Biden?" We wouldn't address, or Trump or whatever. We wouldn't address them in that way, but we talk about them in that way. But we would give the honor due to the office and the person having that in there. And often we talk about people who affect positions of honor by bringing shame to them and different things. So I think we would think about it differently, but I do think we have an underlying sense of people that we hold in high honor, respected members of a community, people that perform great philanthropy, that do things amongst the community, are honorable in their behavior, that are moral and ethical, that are wise, that maybe even have a pretty noble birth, that may come from a good lineage, in a good family background. And so I think we have an underlying sense of it, but it may not be as much of a driving force in our society that wealth and fame are, in popularity. I think maybe there's a little bit of difference there, or maybe a lot of difference there. That may not have been a good question. We do not understand shame, but shame's not just embarrassment. Shame is, I didn't fulfill my duties to society, and therefore I am going to have social courtesies removed from me. Now, we'll talk in a little bit about 1 Corinthians 5 and how that passage is affected by that thought.
Yeah, do we want to go ahead and jump there, or do you want to define whatever you want to do? More? Let's go ahead and jump into it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about earlier, we talked about a comparison today about followers, like on social media and your social media cred, how you have those things. And in today's modern day cultures, bringing dishonor on a family or somebody that's the head of a family, who your children are going to marry, how they behave even as adults. I told a class last night that I really truly believe in the qualifications for an elder. We see their reputation with those outside, and that they have trustworthy children. I think it is not just talking about children that live under their roof. I think it's children who are underneath the patriarch of that family, the paterfamilia, in Roman thought, that they can bring shame upon their parent because of their disobedience or their lack of trustworthiness, their faithfulness to their family, and perhaps even their faithfulness to God, by their behavior and who they're going to marry. We don't think about that. We don't arrange marriages for our kids. We may influence those things, but if you're in India and the head of the family said you're not going to marry that woman because she's not from an honorable family, you wouldn't do it. I mean, it's one of the, because it would bring shame, and the shame of your family would be very, very important. And thinking through that, but we it maybe is a decent comparison. We'll talk more in the patron-client thing about maybe followers, but I do think it's important that we think about where in the New Testament. And 1 Corinthians 5 is one that really hits home, and I think it's really very foreign to us if we wanted to address that now as we think through that a little bit. We've talked a little bit about genealogy and family origins. In 1 Corinthians 5, 1-8, we have someone who is committing sin, terrible sin, a public and well-known sin there. And the solution that Paul gives for two reasons is to put that person out of your midst. And there's two reasons he gives for that. So that person may be shamed to repentance, and so that a little bit of yeast won't leaven the entire loaf. And this goes back to what we said about what we need to talk about, and we'll talk about, is the importance of the community over the individual, which is not the American ideology and not the way we think about our lives. But we try to think about this in modern day church vernacular. We might say this person was disfellowshipped, because he was sinning an unrepentant sin, and that occurs in modern day churches. But today we think, well, if we did that to someone, they're just going to go find another church. They're not going to be with that. They'll go find, and we're going to be embarrassed because that person's going to get on social media and say, well, they didn't love the sinner. and thinking through that, because we don't think about what Paul was saying is that sin running rampant in the congregation is damaging, and the congregation is more important than the individual. And damaging a lot of Christians is something we can't allow to happen. But in Paul's day and time, in the church in Corinth, if you were ostracized from that group and shunned from that group, I think even non-Christians would view that as shameful for that person. And immersed in that culture, the thing was this person receives such shame that they say that it forces them to change their ways. Our society doesn't necessarily function that way. They would receive a lot of pity in our society. So we have to be careful in how we practice those things, but I certainly don't think elders ought to put individuals before the congregation ever in that case. But that we have to think about how are we going to handle unrepentant sin in the congregation today that not only saves the congregation from corruption, but also saves the individual from that. And so that's something that has to be looked at.
Yeah, I definitely think that's much harder because that obviously the congregation to individual principles there, like you were saying, but the ability to bring somebody back who is struggling with sin, there's not that pull there. Just because they could go anywhere else and there's not that, I don't know, the community accountability and family there just seems to be so much different in our society than what they had there.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that churches shouldn't practice it. I'm not saying that, because we need to think about the health of the entire congregation. Some things that I also had written down, sometimes people have a collective opinion of people. Like I think about Nathaniel when they were telling about Jesus was from Nazareth in John 1:46. What good comes out of Nazareth? Or when Paul says all Cretans are liars, that almost tells you people had a bad reputation or a low reputation. And we talked about genealogies earlier. Jesus even talks about when in Matthew 13, when he goes back to his own hometown and he's rejected, he says, a prophet is not without honor except within his own hometown. And so we even see that word from that. Jesus' illustrations and metaphors about banquet seating. Remember, you seat in a place of honor. We kind of sit at tables in certain ways, like the head of the household may sit at the head of the table, but who sits next to that person may not necessarily be thought of as the most honored guest.
Really, just like weddings is the only time that I feel
somebody
like
sitting at the middle table.
That's seating
right.
Based on
your wedding party's going to sit here, and then it kind of flows downhill. The cousins are at the back table, the mom and dad, because they're paying for it, are at the front table. But yeah, that kind of seating would be good imagery, and certainly wedding banquet imagery is something used by Jesus. But he cautions about that. I think when James and John asked, can we sit at your right hand and your left hand in your kingdom? Those are positions of honor. Of course, Jesus tells them, you better be careful what you ask for. Jesus is at the right hand of God. That's a position of honor. In Philippians 2, when Paul says, Jesus here was in a position of great honor, and he lowered himself, humbled himself to the point of greatest shame on a cross, and thereby God exalted him and lifted him up and gave him honor, a name above all names type language. There is honor and shame in that entire discourse that his audience would have understood. I'm not saying Paul was teaching honor and shame. I'm saying Paul was speaking within an honor and shame framework many times when he was talking through those things. And so there's nothing more shameful than being crucified on a cross.
This may be a bad example. So we didn't talk about this beforehand. But when I'm thinking about this honor and shame, it's just so different from our society because, like, most people would be like, well, I don't care what other people think. I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. And there's a lot of, like, I don't know, there's a lot of, like, pride in that. Mm-hmm. Like, I think of an example that touches both of our sports teams. Like, when I think of Tua, football player from Alabama, now playing at the Dolphins, like, his father had a lot of influence on where he was going to go to school and was kind of like, no, I think you need to make this decision with your life. And he was like, so I listened to my father. Even though he was like 18 and above at the time, it was like, to him, it was like in his interviews, it was no way that I would dishonor my family and the ties to my family. And like a lot of other fans and other people were like, that doesn't make any sense. Like he's an individual. He's got his own freedom. Who cares what his father or his family thinks? But I just think that's interesting. I don't know if that kind of
his culture.
If you're with me, and his culture. Yeah,
think about either a Samoan or some other Pacific Islander culture, where it's the patriarch of the family. If for example his grandfather may have still been alive, and his grandfather wanted him to go to a certain school, to his father may have deferred to the grandfather in his honor.
But he seemed happy with that. Like,
we
he got a lot of contentment in fulfilling those wishes, where other people in America would be like, there's no fulfillment, there's no
you should have done exactly
joy,
the opposite.
There's no idea. Yeah,
you
like,
should have
so
done exactly.
It's just interesting how different some cultures are of what motivates us and what brings us about like happiness and fulfillment in life. Like,
well, we think about what really, I tell people, if you want to understand how startlingly different our culture is from modern day Middle Eastern or countries and their culture, that's how different our culture is from the culture that Jesus lived in. Because keep in mind, their culture really hasn't changed. Borderlines have changed, maybe some geography's changed, but even some of the provinces haven't changed. There was a province of Syria, for example, when Jesus was alive, that they may even consider killing a family member that brings shame on us. We would never consider killing a daughter or a son. And a lot of times I hear people say, they only kill daughters. Well, no, that's not true. They also would kill a son that bring great shame on the family, because the family's honor is more important than the individual's life or their needs. We cannot fathom that because we think exactly the opposite. Just like you said about an individual.
Yeah.
Well, I got to stand on my own 2 feet. I make my own decisions now. In a lot of ways, it's unwise because we don't benefit the wisdom of others, but we just don't think that way. We think about ourselves in a very individualistic way, and that's what our ideology is. I ought to be able to speak my own mind. I ought to have my own say in things. But I don't think we knowingly want to bring embarrassment on our families, even though we may do that sometimes. But obeying the parent extends. I think honoring your father and mother is misinterpreted when it is said, oh, that is only while they're living under their parents' roof. They always lived under their parents' roof when they lived in the tents of Israel. You are always under the patriarch's roof. We think about it. Abraham, he found a bride for Isaac. Isaac found a bride for Jacob, and they wanted it to come from family. They wanted it to come from somebody we were kin to, and they send a servant. Now, Isaac, seemed to take Rebekah very well, but he didn't pick her out. She was delivered to him, and so they wanted to keep things amongst the family, amongst people we know. We're not going to bring in foreigners amongst this thing. So they were still in charge, and so bringing dishonor upon the head of the family would have been a terrible thing to do, and not be viewed as somebody, even by non-Christians, would not have been viewed as something positive.
All right, Tim, walk us through some other dynamics that are in play with that culture that would be different from ours. Maybe things like the class or even resources that maybe we wouldn't just think about, that we would automatically take what we experience and apply it to the text.
Yeah, first, kind of an easy one. This could be a much longer discussion, but it's something that we do not understand. And I told my class the other night, we understood it more during COVID, and it's called limited resources, limited resource dynamic. We kind of believe, or we really do believe, in unlimited resources. I turn the faucet on, water comes out. Most people have no consideration of what it takes and the machine it takes to actually deliver that water just magically shows up at your house. The sewer magically disappears. Electricity magically comes in the wall. Food is always on the grocery store shelves or in the pantry. There's plenty of things. We live in a land of plenty, and that's why we don't understand limited resources. There's only so much food to go around in the ancient world. There's also only so much honor, maybe only so much grace from God. Not just in a physical sense, but in a maybe even a spiritual sense, but very, very limited resources. And so it lets us look at the Bible and understand. I think people understand, well, maybe they didn't have as much wealth as we do. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But even with wealth, there is only so much. We understand, hey, if we need something, we can just fly it in from another country, or we can ship it in by boat, or we can go get it by military force. Their world was very confined and only so much coming in. When there was a famine, you had to go to Egypt to get grain. It wasn't as if I could call in the Second Harvest Food Bank or disaster relief or something. You just starved to death because there wasn't enough food. If you didn't grow it, you didn't eat it. And so they're very, very limited resources world, and therefore I covet what my neighbor has because he's got it and there's only one of them. And so I want it. It's not of this. I covet my neighbor's vehicle. I'd like to go down to the dealership and buy a vehicle just like it. He's got the only one. And so I want it. So I want to take it away from him to get that. And so I know we're going back to kind of Old Testament thought, but the world wasn't really that terribly different that we would experience it. So one of the things we need to keep in mind, even as we read spiritual aspects of things, that they believed in a finite number of resources, whereas we think of we can always get more toilet paper. Well, until all of a sudden we can't. That it's not there, or there's a strike that shuts down.
And we lose our minds.
And we absolutely.
If anything becomes limited,
lose our mind. That's right. Even though for the vast majority of human existence, toilet paper hasn't been there, and the vast majority of other people in the world use a bidet. It's something paper towels. When we can't function without it. Well, can you use rags? But there's only so many rags to go around. We don't fathom that, as there's always going to be cans on the shelf. For them, there was not always going to be, obviously I'm speaking proverbially, cans on the shelf. They're out of green beans today. They'll restock it this afternoon. No, there may not be any more green beans, period. And so we need to appreciate that, not just to think about them as poor people, but I'm talking about anybody had limited resources. Water is a big deal when God shut the skies up, and didn't have famine, and you had famines or drought or anything along those lines, because there was a very limited number of things you had access to.
What about the distribution of wealth or classes? Maybe would be another way of saying that.
Extremely stratified. I told the class last night, when we think about social movement, probably less than 2 or 3% of the people in that entire society we have viewed as like the upper wealthy class. Senatorial level, imperial level, equestrian level of people, upper level military officers, municipal magistrates, people like that, wealthy, maybe some massive merchants that owned a lot of things, had maybe a fleet of ships or a lot of businesses. Extremely small number of people, probably maybe less than 3 or 4 to 5%. Everybody differs, and I think we don't know exactly. No middle class to speak of. And we speak of a middle class in a way of we have enough resources to eat plenty and do other extraneous things, go on vacation, do things, have some disposable income. All my income seems to be disposable, but we have some disposable income. We make some choices that are not just, hey, are we going to be able to take care of food, shelter, and clothing and doing it? Really, for about 70 or 80% of everybody, it was at or below subsistence level, meaning we're making do. We're able to feed ourselves. We got a roof over our head, and we got clothing, but we don't have any excess money. It's why I can't stand some of the teachings on debt and how people spend money and the misuse of the New Testament, as if the vast majority of people were like Americans and be like, well, we're going to go out and buy a new chariot. We're going to go finance a new chariot this week. 80% of the people were not concerned with buying some sort of device that they're going to debt for. They went into debt because they had to feed their family. Debt existed, but not necessarily because of frivolous spending. And so most people were just trying to get by. And a large number of those were maybe even below subsistence level. They're day workers, looking for a job every day. We talked about Jesus giving that parable of people standing in the marketplace, looking for a denarius a day, looking for work, because that's about what it cost to feed a family, was a denarius day. And then there's those that are below subsistence level, orphans, those who are blind, beggars, disabled people, unskilled day laborers, and sometimes you just went without. But having a surplus of money was extremely rare for people. And I don't think that a lot of people that use the New Testament to teach financial stability interpret it properly in that way. Just in thinking through what we think about with debt.
So with this, are those dynamics when you're thinking about the class system, you're also thinking about limited resources. It created a different social framework and interactions than what we think today, where most people we view as like horizontal relationships. Even though some may be wealthier than others, there's kind of horizontal. What was their social frame like different from ours?
Well, we think about, we have upward mobility. We have in the American dream is, even though I may be born to a poor family, the Abraham Lincoln story. I can rise to be president of the United States. I can get an education. I can pull myself up by my own bootstraps, and I can move up the economic, social ladder, political ladder.
That's a speaking point to a lot of politicians.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the move. We think about there's a glass ceiling maybe for some classes of people, or for some genders, or for some races in our country, but some people can break through that. I did the illustration of the class ceilings were made of concrete back then. You were pretty much going to stay in the class you were in. You may rise, to example, to the level of a centurion in the blue-collar military sense. If you could survive long enough and you had enough intelligence, you may move up to a pretty decent, wealthy level. I mean, centurions had enough money to build synagogues, and they could be patrons of the community like we'll talk about here in just a minute. But you were not going to rise up to be the Caesar. It just would be very rare for that to ever occur, or for Jesus to have ever thought, one day I'm going to be a Roman senator. He just wasn't born into that class, and you didn't move out of those classes very easily. Military service was probably one where people could move up. Also, selling oneself into slavery, because you may go into slavery, but whose slave you were is very important, because when you come out as a freed person, you owe some loyalty back to your former master as a patron-client relationship, but you may actually come out at a higher level than you went in. And we'll talk about slavery a little bit later on the episode.
All right, so you mentioned the patron. Can you define kind of this patron/client dynamic? The only time I hear that word today is sometimes like in the podcast world, you could have a patron that supports this like podcast.
Yeah, like a financial resource,
or something like that. Yeah, but what was this dynamic? Is there a way that you can define that for us?
Well, what I would define a patron is like a wealthy individual, a source of financial support, legal aid. Maybe it's somebody who loaned money to people, maybe helped them with legal troubles, maybe helped them get help from another wealthy person by speaking on their behalf. They contributed to the community. Maybe they held great banquets for people. Maybe they built temples, or they built a synagogue like the centurion that Jesus has encountered. Maybe they built meeting places, temples, theaters, baths. They did things for the community or for individuals, and in return, they became clients of that patron, meaning their loyalty was due to them. They would support them in elections. They may ask favors of them. They may attend funerals and weddings of that individual, and so you become client. And the more of them you have, the greater honor you have, and the more prestige that you have of people who rely on you. And I always say this. One of my professors said this in school. If you want to know what that looks like, look at The Godfather. And you think about a person, even outside the United States, organized crime, you had an individual. Before you had a banking system that could get a loan, before you could go online and get a loan, the banking system that we think didn't exist in that day and time, and who's going to give a loan to a person who's barely able to feed his family? Going to a person, a lack of a police force, how are we going to deal with legal issues? What's going to happen when my neighbor has cheated me out of this? I need help in the court system. You're going to go to individuals, and they're going to help you, and in return, you are loyal to them. And they may one day call on you to do a favor for them in return that you're able to accomplish. And so...
Yeah, so the dynamic is mutually beneficial to both individuals, but there is a hierarchy of power and wealth and all these different things. And Tim and I talking about this, one thing that touches a portion of this is when you think about, okay, well, what could a poor person give back to this person? And Tim referenced it as in like, there's power in numbers. Like we see that today, even in like the influencer world now, to where people are able to get things or to have a little bit of power because they're like, hey, I could mention your brand to all my followers, and they're going to probably buy this product or not buy this product based on kind of what I tell them to do. So we see that dynamic of there's power in numbers. Mm-hmm. So there is something they can give back to them that they need that. Like when they go in public, they want to be seen with multiple clients and supporters.
And financially, like that, you think about it, you like people's page or their post or whatever it is that they have. Well, that can mean financial income to them because of advertising and other things. But in this society, it's strange for us to think about just because some people have a lot of loyalty to somebody, giving them great honor and influence. But as a patron, the more clients that I have, it affects my political influence, what I can stir up, what I can't stir up, maybe how I can help put people in certain political positions. Today, we generally associate that with wealth.
Yeah.
As being the only things. And I think patrons were wealthy people. But we don't necessarily always ascribe honor and prestige based on how many people support a certain person.
One thing that I thought was interesting on this, when you think about how does this impact some biblical text and stuff like that, was one paper I read referenced John 15, that when Jesus refers to us as friends, we think of friend as in this horizontal relationship, but they were making the case that people would have saw this hierarchy relationship here between the patron and the client, where the patron would still they wouldn't call him a client, they would call him a friend, but it wasn't an equal partnership friendship there. So when Jesus calls us a friend there in John 15, it's coupled with you're my friend if you obey me, or if you're loyal to me, or if you do these things, to where, once again, it's not saying it's preaching that dynamic, but that's just built into the way that they viewed relationships and dynamics in their culture and stuff. So I thought that was interesting, because I've always thought that was kind of weird when we think of friend isn't it's not equal. I'm not equal to Jesus. He does care about me and love me, but no, there can be a hierarchy and there still be this friendship with somebody.
The philos, you would say. And with that, in that particular instance, he's just speaking of his disciples there. I guess the 11 of them that are left after Judas is gone, but they used to be his disciples. So you had this hierarchy. I'm the teacher, you're the disciples, and now he's saying things have gotten much more even, especially in servanthood thought. But I do agree.
They still care, but there's still a hierarchy.
Still a little bit of a hierarchy. Yeah. I don't think the disciples ever said, "Oh, Jesus is now our equal."
Yeah,
that would be very strange for them to think about.
And I was bringing that up just to say, they understood socially a hierarchy.
Yeah, very natural
at all areas of life.
I think that's an interesting way to say. Also, they had patron deities. For example, we see in Acts 19, Artemis of the Ephesians, the goddess there that had a gigantic temple 4 times the size of a Parthenon, one of the ancient wonders of the world. They're very upset, and they describe Artemis as their patron deity. She takes care of the city. This is Artemis of the Ephesians. Ephesus is under her care, and we're not going to make her upset. Of course, there's some financial things going on there with people who trade in silver shrines and things of that nature, but I think there was a definite feeling that, wait a minute, we're going to upset the patron of our people, the patron god of our society. Also in the early church, people like Stephanus, Phoebe, Lydia may have been viewed as patrons that allowed the church to meet in their house, because not everybody had a house that was big enough for people to gather in. So you had to rely on wealthy and influential people too. I think the church had a lot of wealthy and influential people. Church has a lot of wealthy and influential people today and couldn't exist without it. So some of these that let the church meet in their house or did a lot of good things for poor people and helped out a lot of people in a patron sense. But we need to make sure and not say, this is not always to bring glory on yourself in an arrogant, self-serving way. It may have just been a very natural way of existence. Yeah,
which is so foreign to us, but that's...
No, everything we want is for power, fame, and fortune.
All right, let's go ahead and go to our last area, which would be slavery.
Okay.
Tim, how is slavery that we think of in America in our history, how is it different and then maybe similar to what we see in the first century?
Okay, and we need to definitely define that, because that's obviously such a disgusting institution in American history. It's the most disgusting and embarrassing thing in our history, in my opinion, to have that. And when we look at English translations, often in the preface, they're very cautious of how they're going to translate the Hebrew word ebed and the Greek word doulos. A lot of times they may translate it servant or bondservant, depending on context, sometimes slave. And I think we have to be very careful how we remove that, and I'll explain that here in just a minute. I prefer slave for a lot of reasons, not because I support the enslavement of African Americans in the 18th and 19th century North American and Caribbean slave system. There were some things that would be the same. And so when we talk about, I'll say North American slavery, so I'm going to include everything in the United States and the Caribbean, that slave system versus a Greco-Roman slave system, there were a lot of similarities. Slaves were property. They were owned, they were bought, they were sold, they were traded. Sometimes they were stolen. So they were regarded as property. They were often abused. Sometimes they may have even been killed. I've heard some say that the records of Rome, and some places it was illegal to kill a slave, but I don't know how well enforced that was. That may be very different from some, way off farmer in Galatia somewhere versus somebody in Rome. And so those are certainly similarities that we would see. And even I would say there was a black market business sometimes for slaves in the way that they were treated. But we need to be careful about comparing that directly to North American slavery. Those things were the same. But in North American slavery, people were enslaved because of the color of their skin and because those people were not regarded as fully human. That's not necessarily the case with Greco-Roman slaves. They could be any color skin. They could look just like anybody else walking down the road. It wasn't like when we go back to the antebellum South, that if you saw an African-American walking down the street, you would think, I bet he's a slave. In Greco-Roman world, it'd be people that had the same color skin as everybody else who walking in the road. I don't know if they're a slave. They're not. Maybe there's some indicative clothing along that sense, but they weren't enslaved because of the color of their skin. They were in slavery because they were captured in war, or perhaps they were born to a slave, or perhaps they sold themselves into slavery, or maybe their parents sold them into slavery. Because for economic reasons or whatever it may want, you could voluntarily enter slavery. I don't think many people voluntarily entered slavery in the North American culture, and so it's important for us.
Before we leave that point there, remember what we just covered about the limited resources and all. Like, it's not like you could just go out and take another mortgage on your house, these So for some of these situations, it appears that your options were either slavery, or you may starve to death, or your family may starve to death, right? Would that be
right. You may save your children's life by selling them into slavery because you can no longer feed them. And so somebody may take them. Now, of course, sometimes orphans were taken into slavery, abandoned children may have been taken into slavery, infants that have been put out for exposure may have been taken up as slaves, but it may very well be that the only way you're going to eat is to put yourself into slavery. And sometimes, or because you owe a debt. And sometimes we might translate that as bondservant. And because I owe a certain amount of debt. And so then for you also have a limited amount of slavery. I'm going to be your slave for X number of years because I owe you X number of money in doing that. And that leads us into a very, very big difference is the concept of being a freed person, meaning I'm a slave that will eventually gain my freedom, is a reality. That's not a reality for slaves in North America in 18th, 19th century. You may even be able to buy your freedom. Some slaves were called, I think what it's pronounced in Latin is a pecunium, meaning you were paid a little bit of a wage that you could save up during slavery to buy yourself out of slavery. And so maybe, I think at one time even people said, Octavian said, hey, there's too many slaves being freed on the Italian peninsula. We're getting too many of these into society because it does upset the balance of the economy. Sometimes freed persons that were former slaves came out at a higher social status than people that were born free. They may have even come out in a different way than people that were originally born free. We don't ever think about that necessarily in our slave system that we are familiar with in our American history books.
And my understanding they would end up being a client who they were a slave to would be their patron.
Yeah, if I freed you, now I still look at you as, hey, you're going to support me and be loyal to me in whatever capacity that wound up manifesting itself. Another big difference would be education. We would never have dreamt of in plantations of educating slaves where they can read and write and do things. That was not a negative thing because you may very well have slaves that are in charge of businesses you own. They may be running your store down in the marketplace. They may be in charge of other slaves. They may be in charge of portions of your estate. They may educate your children. They may be someone who escorts your children to and from school or teaches them certain manners and certain things about pedagogos that we read about, like in Galatians 3, for example. Slaves being educated was not viewed as a disaster, or a negative thing or beaten down. In some ways, I think an educated slave may have been more valuable in that sense. And so those are some big differences, especially the real anticipation of freedom and being emancipated or even being manumitted by your master or actually achieving or finishing up your period of slavery, whatever that may wind up being viewed as. Those things are just very, very different. And it's important that we recognize those differences so that people do not view the Bible as necessarily endorsing slavery. Now, I'll guarantee you that there were pulpits of Churches of Christ and other Christian traditions that advocated slavery during the time slavery was a governmentally approved institution in the United States, and they used the Bible to justify it, but they were ignorant men that did it. They did not understand the differences between the systems, or they were just downright evil men that did it, but they may have been ignorant people who did it, not understanding that.
So does the Bible give any theological stances on the idea or the system of slavery?
I don't think it addresses it as we would like for it to be. Now, even in the time, we want to not miss the fact that even in the time of Paul and Christ, whether or not slavery was right or wrong was a philosophical debate. I think even back into Greek history, it would be a very philosophical debate about humans and enslaving them, but wasn't a political football like it was, for example, in the latter part of the 19th century. And look at that. I do think we could talk about, like, obviously we have a very, very poignant example in Paul's letter to Philemon about Onesimus, who has been a runaway slave, who's become a Christian. He's being sent back. Paul even tells him, hey, if he owes you something because of him being gone, then put it on me. But I think Paul encourages him not to penalize Onesimus, to view him differently because he's a brother now. But I don't think Paul ever advocates the abolition of the industry. It is, I always make this analogy, when we think about how important petroleum products are to the North American economy, which is way more than just gasoline or diesel fuel. Remove that from the economy, and that's the equivalent of removing Greco-Roman slavery from that economy. It was uber critical element of it. There were, I think some scholars estimate as close as many as 2 million slaves in the Roman Empire, and maybe a huge number of that concentrated around Rome and on the Italian peninsula. I think Paul would have been run out of town, maybe even killed, if he had tried to advocate the abolition of slavery. What was in Paul's heart, I don't know. We certainly know that he teaches equivalence now. When people are Christian, there's no longer Jew, nor Greek, nor slave, nor free, and master. But he still, as we'll talk about in household codes, there's still a master-slave relationship, and he regulates it. He says, masters, here's how you're going to treat your slaves now that you're Christian. Slaves, here's how you'll be obedient to your masters. So contrary to calling for abolition, I think Paul, inspired by the Holy Spirit, I know, gave regulations for it, just like the Old Testament gives regulations for slavery. I think that Paul regulated and said, here's how we're going to behave within the frameworks that exist that we can't do anything about. Paul couldn't preach slavery out of existence. If I could interview Paul on the side and say, hey, do you think it's right to enslave people? I think it's a pretty fair bet that Paul might say, I really wish we could get rid of that. I really wish that didn't exist. But I don't know of a place where he calls for its abolishment.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember what Paul did teach on it. The biggest thing when you think about slavery in our history is the hatred and the devaluing that is an individual, somebody created in God's image. So Paul doesn't get anywhere near those elements. What he's encouraging them is, hey, you view them as a brother in Christ. You love them. And, so that dynamic there to me changes. We're not comparing apples to apples. Mm-hmm. Even in that system that seems so inhumane to us, the reality is there could be people that their life isn't worse being in that situation than if they couldn't go indebted to somebody and die of starvation. Mm-hmm. There's just so many different elements there to that. The teachings that we do see in Scripture is that, no, they do have value. Mm-hmm. They are a person. They are a brother in Christ. There's not that hierarchy of devaluing somebody as a person. So to me, you can't compare what occurred in history versus Paul's teaching there of saying, oh, he supports that system of what occurred in our nation.
And I understand why people would view that negatively in the Bible, because the only system they have in their mind is what we have. Do I think that system was righteous? Absolutely not. I don't think it was righteous to enslave other human beings. Thinking through that. But we don't want to paint too negative a picture of it, because Paul uses the metaphor. You used to be slaves to sin, now you're slaves to Christ. Well, if we only view slavery as negative and horrible, well, I don't want to be Christ's slave. But if we cushion the word too much, we take away the aspect of ownership. We belong to Christ. And we say that all the time. I've been bought with the blood. You think about what that even means in Scripture. And we've been purchased. Well, okay, that's what you do with slaves. You buy them. Now, I understand redemption theology and all that the price has been paid for our sin and all that, so I don't want to say that I'm totally encompassing that. But obviously, Paul's Roman audience didn't think it was too negative to hear that we're a slave of Christ. We used to be owned by sin, now we're owned by Christ, and we've been bought by his blood. Okay, that means that we are owned by Christ. And we would have any problem admitting that. We would sing that in our songs.
Yeah, and it's much different than thinking, oh, I work for Christ.
Yeah, that's right.
That's much different than, oh, no, like Christ owns me. Like I've given my life over to him. So you referenced this early on the translation part of it. Is that really what you were saying of we don't want to get too far away from that word because we lose that?
I think so.
Theology.
Yeah. When we think about servant in modern day English, and I know this may be different if the Lord wills time, in 25th century English, servant, we think about a butler. Mm-hmm. We think about somebody who is a housekeeper or a butler or someone who gets compensated. We do not think of them being owned. We don't have any problem calling ourselves servants of God and servants of Christ, and we very well are. But I think if we remove that word slaves too much from where it belongs in the New Testament or in the Old Testament, we lose a little bit of, especially when it's used metaphorically, I think we lose a little bit of its value as a word and its definition. If I just say, you were servants to sin, now you're servants to Christ. Well, I used to work for sin, now I work for Christ. That loses a little bit of its value to me.
Yeah.
I'm chained to sin, now I'm chained to Christ. That to me, there's a difference between those things.
You got any closing thoughts as we wrap up here, Tim?
No, and I know we've barely touched on this, and there's probably some things that we have said that need expanding on, or maybe clarification, or maybe even correction. But the hope is that it just help people maybe understand a little bit better that, hey, I need to research into these things and see how would the original audience have understood this language, these metaphors, these parables, whatever it is, these actual historical events within the umbrella of their culture and how they thought, which is very different than ours.
Yeah. Next week, we're going to be looking at the home, of how that was different than what the dynamics are for our households today. If you got any questions or suggestions for future topics, let us know by emailing us at podcast@mountjuliet.org. To our fellow students of Scripture, thank you for joining us for tech support. We hope you will join us next week.
This is a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ. You can find more personal growth resources like this one at mountjuliet.org/resources. The Mount Juliet Church of Christ exists to glorify God and make disciples by helping people grow in Christ, love one another, and serve others.